Politics. Oh no, anything but that. And this video is about some of the politics surrounding the French Revolution, which is really disappointing to me because I don't like this time period at all. I have no personal connection with these wackos. It's a very small corner of a small part of a big world. But just like the storylines from Greek myths keep showing up every time I turn on an action movie, these debates keep showing up every time I turn on cable news, which is why I don't do that. Anyway, here's our source, Will and Ariel Durant's 11-volume work, The Story of Civilization, in which they observed cycles of concentrating wealth and explosive revolutions, a procession of states rising, prospering, dying, but each in turn handing on the civilizing heritage of customs, morals, and arts, passing the torch from one runner to the next. And the craziest part of the whole thing is that most people agree on what the end goal should be. Happy and healthy people being happy and healthy and, for lack of a better word, free. The big question is how to get there, given that nature is cruel, and human nature is even worse. Good thing it's the Enlightenment, and we'll start with Thomas Paine, who supported the right, capital R, of every man to his own opinion. Think about it this way: if you don't let other people disagree with you, you are making yourself a slave, his word, a slave to your current opinion. Disagreement is good, dogmatism is bad. Paine practiced what he preached and got in trouble everywhere he went. The point is that things can change because things were changing. You know, science, exploration, and reason, especially reason. The most formidable weapon against every kind of error. I have never used any other, and I trust it shall never fail. Welcome to the Enlightenment. But that, according to Edmund Burke, was unrealistic. Politics ought to be adjusted not to abstract reasonings, but to human nature as we find it. There are no absolute human rights. And even if there were, it would be useless to argue about them. Let's deal instead with the things we can plainly see, a world of competing interests. The goal of politics should be to coordinate these interests for the good of the continuing group. The challenge is not to let any group become too complacent or too desperate to stop contributing to the common good. Condorcet was more optimistic that the new philosophers could not only manage but also improve humanity, emancipate us from our shackles, again his word, advance with firm steps along the path of truth, virtue, and happiness. Through contemplation, the philosopher lives with his peers in Elysian spheres created by reason and graced by the purest pleasures known to the love of mankind. Alright, that sounds nice, but what does it mean in practice? Well, Voltaire had some ideas, a lot of ideas really. He wrote a letter of advice to Louis XVI when that guy was crowned king, the same guy who would later be guillotined during the Revolution. Voltaire's message: clean up the corruption, stop wasting money on the court, and then the poor who work hard will be given the immense riches of certain idle men. Voltaire singled out corrupt religious figures and what he saw as backwards religious policies. Stop treating minor offenses as great crimes. End the use of torture. Stop being ruled by the church. And lastly, we shall dare to pronounce the word tolerance. In other words, 1,000 years of burning heretics at the stake should be enough. According to Will and Ariel Durant, the king tried to take Voltaire's advice. France at that time was facing major challenges, a bankrupt government and a starving population. To avoid discontent in the cities, the government had controlled the trade in grain and the price of bread. But the low prices made farming unprofitable. Vast areas of farmland laid unsown, and the potential wealth of the nation was being checked at its source. The king's finance minister, Turgot, tried to deregulate the market, a move supported by Voltaire. But as the price of bread rose in the spring of 1775, riots broke out in several cities. Men went from town to town, rousing the people to revolt, burning some stockpiles of grain and throwing others into the Seine. The minister blamed the officials who had lost their posts through the end of regulation. He said they were trying to create in Paris a scarcity of grain that would compel a return to a controlled trade. And if that was their cause, their plan worked. Louis XVI forbade his troops to fire upon the people and ordered a reduction in the price of bread. And since this is the Enlightenment, we can point out that everyone was acting rationally. The people who destroyed the bread, they were protesting the only way they could. After all, they could not afford to buy the bread at the higher prices anyway. The officials who stirred up the mob felt that they had a right to oversee the government-controlled market. After all, they still had to pay back the money they had borrowed to bribe their way into those offices. So what good is it to apply to reason to understand this mess? The best way, according to Burke, to ensure a sufficient supply of bread is to concentrate less on the peasant's right to low prices and more on his right to profit from the fruit of his labor. This is true even if those profits for 1,000 different reasons would be accumulated unequally. It's an example of the apparent irrationality of wisdom. Even though it seems unreasonable that one family should own so much and another so little, and even more unreasonable that an owner should be allowed to transmit his property to successors who had not lifted a hand to earn it, yet experience has found that men in general will not bestir themselves to work and study, or to laborious and extensive preparation, unless they may call the results of their efforts their own property, to be transmitted in large measure as they desire, and experience has shown that the possession of property is the best guarantee for the prudence of legislation and the continuity of the state. Burke would have encouraged the king to stand up to the mob and the bureaucrats, even if it meant calling in the army. And after writing 10,000 pages on the greatest achievements of art and science, the Durants were convinced that individuals, although equal in dignity and worth, are definitely unequal when it comes to their abilities. Civilization advances when the genius of a Mozart or a Da Vinci or a Newton is allowed to flourish and push ahead in an already developed field, pushing it to new heights still. No individual, however brilliant and well-informed, can in one lifetime acquire the knowledge and wisdom that would warrant him to sit in judgment upon those complex, subtle, and persisting traditions that embody the experience and judgment of the community or nation. After thousands of experiments in the great laboratory called history, civilization would be impossible if the practice of all moral duties and the foundation of society rested upon having their reasons made clear and demonstrative to every individual. A social practice might not make sense to you if you're 16, but you might appreciate having it around when you are 60. This is Burke's critique of the French Revolution, and it convinced those who hoped the unrest would stay in Paris and not spread to London. It was especially persuasive to the English government. After all, they had the most to lose. But taken to its extreme, Burke's position seemed to condone any action, no matter how brutal or intolerant, if it claimed to preserve social order. And what good is preserving a bad social order anyway? Burke did not convince those who saw the revolution a legitimate protest against an unjust and an incompetent government, and that brings us back to Thomas Paine. He demanded the replacement of monarchy and aristocracy by a republic, a graduated income tax that would redistribute concentrated wealth and would use it to wipe out unemployment and poverty and to provide education for every child, a pension for the old. Today, these positions are assumed to be common sense for any civilized society, but 200 years ago they were radical ideas. Paine saw in the French Revolution the proper charter for a modern state, men born free and equal, a government instituted to protect these rights, and, number 3, the nation as the source of all sovereignty. No kings, no churchmen, no ancient customs could stand in the way of the demands of justice revealed by reason. Not so fast, cautioned Burke. These institutions hold society together, controlling the innate individualism of man and the power of their primitive instincts. If you disband these traditions, the one great source of civilization among us, it is all too likely that some new, uncouth, pernicious, and degrading superstition will take their place. You get rid of something bad, well, it might be replaced by something worse. Burke was skeptical that the new French Republic would improve the character or the lot of most men. He saw in the Revolution the breakdown of law, society, and even virtue. And it was virtue, not political reforms, that reached into the heart of the matter, the evil tendencies of human nature. The reforms changed only the surface form of that evil, for they effected no change in the heart of man. And Burke was, sad to say, at least partially right. The enthusiasm for the Republic darkened into the terror and then ended with the return of the aristocracy under Emperor Napoleon. The instinct to persecute passed from religion to politics as the state became the guardian of order and the object of heretical dissent. Napoleon adopted a scientific approach to government, and that approach also had a dark side. Thomas Malthus appreciated Condorcet's optimism about the perfectibility of man and society, but when Malthus looked at the evidence, he came to the opposite conclusion. There was no way, he thought, for food production to keep pace with population growth. As a result, there was no use in raising the wages of working men, for if the wages were increased, the workers would marry earlier, have more children, the population would grow, the mouths would increase faster than the food production, and poverty would be restored. Likewise, it was useless to provide assistance to the poor. It would lead to idleness, larger families, higher prices, starvation, and misery. This is a totally different view from Turgot, who we saw earlier, but Malthus was wrong. In the centuries after the French Revolution, both the population and life expectancy in Europe grew. Overall, the quality of life improved as well, thanks to science. The same science that gave us devastating tools for human slaughter. The same science that magnified and continues to magnify the inequality in power and wealth in society. For all that, however, politics is not a zero-sum game. Just because progress is uneven doesn't make it unreal. Just because progress is possible does not mean it is inevitable. To the cynic, half of us are busy defending the mistakes of the past, while the other half of us are busy creating new mistakes in the future. At the very least, the well-meaning reformer must admit that the darker side of humanity, the urge to identify an enemy and make him pay for his crimes, real or imagined, that darker side, it will rear its ugly head no matter what political reforms are put in place. And so, we give the last word to Voltaire, or at least what Will and Ariel Durant say about him, that we owe to him, more than any other individual, the tolerance that now exists in parts of the West. Religious censorship declined until it tacitly admitted defeat. And if, as seems possible, our children may have to fight all over again the battle for the freedom of the mind, let them seek inspiration and encouragement in the 99 volumes of Voltaire. They will not find there one dull page.